which is called NetSpace. If we can get that slide up. Wonderful. So if you are a multitasker and cannot help but be on your phone during an event, we encourage you to try NetSpace, our in-house AI agent that you can discuss live what's happening on this event, what the panelists are saying. If there's an acronym you didn't understand, if you have a question, please feel free to join us. I'll give everyone a second if you want to scan that little QR code and engage with our wonderful in-house tool built by the Applied Social Media Lab here at Berkman Klein. And with that, thank you, and turning it over to the panelists.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having us, everyone. Everyone should have some time to scan this. I think before we get started, we could just set the pace a little bit. And what is agentic AI? I think it would make sense to define it in contrast to generative AI. So, James, I'm going to start asking a few questions to you. I like the definition that generative AI is something that speaks to you, for example, and agentic AI is something that does tasks for you. Does this definition make sense to you? Do you have any other way that you view agentic AI?
I think it's a good question. Can people hear me, by the way? Is the
No,
microphone
you're
loud?
not on mic.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah.
There we go. That's Harvard-style leadership. Okay, so that's sort of like this. So I think, to me, the big thing that defines agentic, excuse me? Oh, even closer. There we go. That defines agentic AI is this notion that the models can be doing things unprompted, in parallel, and at rapid pace. And I think those two things together, the fact that the models can be doing things independently and at pace, are important. And I think that sort of follow-up important aspect is, are they understandable, what these models are doing? And I think it's sort of the combination of all three. The models execute independently, without us doing things, in a way that may not be explainable, is what makes things sort of agentic and perhaps concerning in the context of this panel here.
Yeah. I think that's a great definition. Does anyone want to add something? Are we good on that? I think that's pretty good. I should also say to the audience, we will talk for about 40 minutes in the panel, and then it will be 20 minutes questions. So if you have anything to ask, please feel free to think about it and ask us in the end. So with that being said, to set the stage, James, again, since you're a cybersecurity legend, I must say, and an expert in this area, what is the good, the bad, and the ugly of agentic security? What are some opportunities for defenders, some opportunity for attackers, and where does the playing field change?
So I think the big opportunity for both the defenders and the attackers is the fact that you can have someone acting on, at least in theory, for your best interest, just working independently. So for example, think about what happens when you develop software. We're very used to this human-based workflow where I propose a change, then all of you look at it, and then we sort of have a human-level agreement or disagreement about whether my change was good or not. Now you can have agents do that. And at least in theory, that's great, right? Because you can have your agents looking for cybersecurity vulnerabilities, for example. So that's very helpful for the defenders. But of course, as you may have heard about some of these models that have been leaked through various sort of data breaches and whatnot, the frontier model companies are very worried about the attacker side of things, where the attacker now wants this ability to say, oh, I found this code base. I just want to have the agent just stare at it and just find vulnerabilities that can then be exploited. And I think right now it's actually not clear who has the upper hand there, whether this is more helpful for the defenders or for the attackers. I think the unfortunate thing, though, is that if we look at traditional sort of defenses against terrorism and things like that, the bad people only have to win once in some sense, whereas the defenders have to be vigilant all the time. So I think, to me at least, that's sort of a concerning aspect of what it means to think about agentic cybersecurity attacks and defenses.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sort of following on to that, Robert, you have a lot of experience from the White House, working with very, very high-stakes and interesting questions. It is probably undeniable that agentic AI will change the cybersecurity landscape. It makes cyber attacks much cheaper to launch. There's a lot of consequences following that for national security, for geopolitics. We saw after the US-Iran tensions increased, there was, I think, Palo Alto Networks reported 60 hacker groups rapidly forming and starting obliterating US critical infrastructure. So based on your experience, what does agentic security mean for national security?
Well, I want to begin with what it means for individual consumers, what it means for individual citizens. I think what we've seen over just the last year is it took longer than I expected for attackers to start using AI, right? A year ago, we still had email messages in our inbox that had misspellings, that were not colloquial English, that were easy to identify if you were vigilant as, yeah, this is not actually from Chase Card Services, this is an attack. Now, all those signals are gone, right? I mean, you are going to get something that is going to look exactly, graphically, wording-wise, appropriate from your bank, from wherever you are interacting. So we're seeing that now. The second thing we're seeing is the ability to harvest information from the dark web, from previous breaches, to target those attacks. So, I was just looking back, I keep a file of phishing emails. I was looking back and I had not had a single attack in the last year targeting me that wasn't actually at a bank that I work with, right? So they were looking at past breaches and they're saying, yep, we know he's at Capital One, right? All the attackers out there know it. I don't mind you guys knowing it at Capital One. That's pretty terrifying. So they know how to hit that. And they know to do it at the times of day when I am most susceptible to clicking on it. And yet we're not at a point where the defenders are using Agentic AI to make the decisions to keep that out of my mailbox, to block any transaction I might make, to enter my password in a web browser. So the technology's there, but the economics that are driving the attackers to use the tools are not yet working for the defenders. So there is a gap in adoption.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And last week on Wednesday, there was actually a congressional hearing on scam and fraud. It is good. It seems to be doing a little bit. It's good. Yeah, on scams and fraud, we're talking about a lot of these things. It's the people in DC seem to care about this, which is quite interesting. And I do agree that the scam, that's also close to my research, and deception is a really big problem. It's so easy to create personalized emails at scale. And that brings us to another question I wanted to ask you, Josephine, about, you mentioned economics, and you're an expert in the economics of cybersecurity. Again, Agentic AI changes this equation a lot, and some attacks get cheaper for attackers, some attacks actually get cheaper to defend against, so that there's an asymmetry in the changes. What's your take on this? What's your greatest and latest news about how does economics affect cybersecurity in the age of AI?
So I think, for me, it's interesting to think about the economics of cybersecurity from a couple different angles when you're sort of doing your original or your initial threat model, when you're thinking about who might try to attack my country, my company, my personal computing setup. Often you have a very, very long list of, right, here are all the possible threats I can think of. And one of the ways we often prioritize them is based on, well, who would actually have the resources to do this kind of attack, right? Who would be able to hire the people or purchase the vulnerabilities needed to find a vulnerability in our critical infrastructure networks, to find a 0-day, something like that. And we have not, perfectly mathematically proven ideas of that, but we have some general sense of who's going to be able to do that kind of work and invest in attacks that way. And I think for all of the reasons that Rob and James were just talking about, Agentic AI makes it much harder for us to have confidence in those assessments, to say only the Chinese government could ever invest the resources necessary to do X, Y, or Z, because that's based on the idea that they're going to hire more people than anybody else, spend more money than anybody else. And if it's possible to do the kinds of large-scale espionage campaigns or cybercrime campaigns that we've seen out of really well-resourced organizations in countries with many fewer resources relying on AI, then I think we have to really approach threat modeling in a new way and say, those assumptions we've been making in somewhat, informal ways about this is going to be too expensive, nobody's going to waste that much effort to attack me, I don't have anything of value, become much harder to parse. I think sort of the best data I've seen on this comes from the Anthropic report on how China has been using generative AI and in how they've sort of incorporated it in every stage of their cyber espionage, right? You can use it to do some of the reconnaissance, to do the research on what bank are you at, and is it worth sending you the Capital One phishing email? You can use it to write that phishing email. You can use it to look for vulnerabilities in the code. You can use it to help code malware, and really sort of putting together at every stage, where does AI play a role? My hope, my expectation even, is that we're going to be able to think about that from the defensive side as well, right? Certainly there are a lot of products and services out there that are selling the idea of using AI for defense. How well they're doing it, I think, as you said, perhaps still a little bit uncertain, but that there are also, I hope, going to be opportunities to do better phishing filtering using AI to do better scanning for vulnerabilities and patching of vulnerabilities using AI. But true to form and true to what we've seen in the past, it does feel a little like the bad guys are getting there first.
And I think one interesting follow-up on that is this question of token economics. I mean, I was so happy that we stopped talking about token economics in the context of cryptocurrency, but then the phrase
we're back.
we're back again. Everything goes in a circle. So, you know, when you think about AI being a leveling sort of factor in the cybersecurity world, there's this question of, you know, who has access though to GPUs or to the tokens. And so, you know, you can see an arms race developing there, where you can imagine that, for example, you know, trying to quantify an attack in terms of how many tokens did it cost to come up with that attack. And then on the defender side, trying to think about how many tokens did it cost to come up with a defense against that. And then you see all kinds of weird sort of side effects come out of thinking of attacks and defenses like that. And you see this already in the corporate sort of non-cybersecurity world with the hoarding of GPUs and with developers now trying to negotiate for token budgets and the contracts that they get with other companies. And I think you'll start to see that at the national security level, even at the corporate security level as well. You know, what does it mean to be a mid-sized company who wants to use an agentic cybersecurity tool? Well, presumably you're paying for that tool either explicitly or implicitly in terms of tokens. And so what does that mean in a world where tokens might become more rare because we're building less data centers, because the demand for tokens goes up, so on and so forth.
So let me, I don't want to jump ahead to the liability question, but it may prompt it. If you are a Google user today, right, my company, we paid the top Google fee for their email filtering service, and yet things still get through. And they're from Gmail accounts that if you are in the right state of mind, you're not jet lagged, you've had your coffee, you're going to be like, this is clearly spear phishing. But it's gone through their filter. And if you're not in the right state of mind, you may actually click on it. And it may lead to a Google Drive that is hosting a PDF saying you've got to sign this from your bank and turn all of your information to that. If you do that, the question I have is, okay, well, why would in that Google ecosystem, would Google not be liable for that? And our answer has always been, well, it's, buyer beware, right? We know the internet's a dangerous place and, we really don't have the technology to stop it. Except today we actually do have the technology to stop it, right? If you take any spear phishing email, I have never yet found a circumstance in which it looks like your run-of-the-mill adversary has put their message through an LLM and said, is this going to pass? Is this spear phishing or not? They always catch it. And the reverse of that, I've never put something through that wasn't spear phishing and had them say, yes, this is spear phishing. So they have the technology. Google has the technology. The economics of them actually killing off this threat vector for average consumers simply doesn't work. It's actually too expensive for the defender to do it for something that we get for free. Yet, the risk to our society is huge. And so, one of the questions that I've been pondering in my policy hat is, okay, how are we going to flip that dynamic and say, look, you have the ability to prevent this harm. It's time that we put in place the airbags and the seatbelts and those things, or we're going to hold you liable for the harm that comes from that.
Now, I think that's a really good point, and sort of spin off on that. You worked a lot with the secure by design and secure by default principles in the White House, which just thinks about this, right? You want to shift liability from the end users to the producers and the companies. I think that's really, really good, and I like the food metaphor, right? If you go to the grocery store and buy some food, you know that that food is safe and it's not gonna kill you. Hopefully, at least in Europe where I'm from. In the US, it's a bit sketchy. You have that, right? And in cybersecurity, we really don't. Sometimes you buy premium products or in IoT devices or what have you, and they're really insecure. So, yeah, Rob, can you maybe keep on telling the audience a little bit about what is secure by design? What's your sort of experience with that? And how does Agentic AI shift that? Because I think it definitely will.
No, yeah, I mean, it absolutely can and it should, and I think that it will. It's just a question of, are we simply going to be raising the bar high enough to make software more secure, or are we going to raise the bar high enough, not high enough, and so Agentic AI is just going to keep finding more and more vulnerabilities in it? So that's the sort of question. When we've looked at secure by design, this was a big effort we made in the Biden administration, was to say, okay, we've got to start saying there are a series of things that you've just got to do if you are building software, right? And I can't rattle them all off. I'm a policy wonk. I'm not a computer scientist. But, it was basic things like you need to use the most current and known secure version of an open source package. If you're not doing that, you should probably be liable for it, right? And our theory was we could run down the list of these 5 things. We made a big push on memory safe languages. We said, look, here's the problem, here's the solution. We got a lot of commitments to start moving to memory safe languages. The problem is there was a massive cost with making these shifts. And so our answer was to say, okay, well, we need to introduce liability over time. We need to say it's not going to be strict liability. I'm also not a lawyer. I realize there's a lot of lawyers in the room. Can't be strict liability. We're not at a place where we can say, look, any error in your software that leads to a harm you need to be responsible for, that will kill off software development. But we could create a safe harbor in which we say, if you've done these 5 things, right now, just these 5 things, you should not be held liable for a bad outcome from your software. If you haven't done these 5 things, you should be. And then I think I already referenced the automotive safety concept. Over time, those standards should increase. So companies might say, we're meeting the 2030 standards in 2026 for software liability. So we would be on a process of continual improvement for what got you out of liability. That was the idea. And to answer the question, yes, I think that Agentic AI can speed us along because it can give us the ability to write and rewrite software much faster than before. The last thing I'll say on this, on open source, every time I've been in the White House, it could have been any period over the last 15 years, there's always been a major open source crisis. And every time that crisis happens, it was Heartbleed in 2014. I don't even remember what it was a few years back, but it prompted the whole community to say, we need to do this better. We need to find a way to sponsor and support these open source organizations, and millions of dollars would get pledged by all the foundations and by all the big tech developers, and then the money wouldn't materialize. There'd be a downturn in the economy, priorities would change. This model totally failed. So my hope is right now that actually with Agentic AI, we're going to see the improvements in open source that humans simply never were going to do because they were never resourced to do.
I think another thing to keep in mind is that, so I totally agree with that. I do wonder, though, what that means, once again, in this context of finite token budgets. Because if you look at how a lot of these agentic programming frameworks are being used now, people are just YOLOing it up. They're like, build me an immersive VR world and just make it as awesome as possible. And they never say make it secure, right? And one reason they never say make it secure is that they just haven't thought about that. And that's fine, that's an education thing. But another reason why they don't say make it secure is that it will cost more tokens. It costs more tokens to run these quote-unquote additional analyses to look for various problems. And so I think that, from the frame of liability or insurance or anything like that, it might start to make sense to try to define some of these requirements for safety in terms of token budget. To say things like, if you get 100 tokens from Claude or whatever, you should spend 20 of them thinking about some of these security issues. Now maybe that sort of strict fractional approach isn't the right way, but I think sort of linking these safety requirements, these security requirements, somehow to the mechanistic act of how we're using these agentic frameworks would be very helpful for understanding what compliance would look like.
I think that's a really good point, and that sort of makes it dive deeper into the liability issue that you mentioned. Let's say we do this, and undeniably Claude Code is going to make something that's insecure. You say make this VR world, super secure, but it's not super secure. There's a bunch of leaks in there. So we have a bunch of genius experts here in the panel, you guys, and so how do we solve this? Who's liable, right? And we're still figuring this out, I feel like, from a legal landscape, but is Anthropic fully liable for that? Is I, as a user, fully liable for that? Or, how do we do this? Do you have any ideas?
You mean how does it work now, or how should it work?
Both.
Both questions I'm not fit to answer. So I would say on the question of how does it work now, it really depends on what the liability is for, right? If you are being sued because your tool generated software that had a vulnerability, you are much less liable for that than you are if you are being sued because you use copyright infringing material as your training data, because those are totally different liability regimes for intellectual property versus software liability. So I think part of the challenge when we talk about liability, and part of the challenge with everything related to AI is so many different things and used for so many different purposes, and there are a lot of kinds of liability that come up, right? There's the liability of my AI customer service agent just promised somebody a free plane ticket and I don't want to honor that. There's the liability of my child just committed suicide after long consultation with this chatbot, and there should be some responsibility. There's the liability around intellectual property. So I think all of those sort of have fairly complicated existing regimes, none of which I'm probably qualified to speak to in this room. But part of the answer is we're starting to see a lot of these cases play out, and as we see that, we will perhaps get a better sense of how courts are understanding some of the ways that those liability regimes apply to AI. I think for me, when I think about the question of who should be liable, again, it depends a lot on what you're liable for. I'm very sympathetic to some of the software liability stuff that came out of your work in the Biden administration, this idea that there should be at least some safeguards, some guardrails that are being built in early on, not just by the people who are generating code, but by the people who are building the tools that will generate the code. I think the challenge is often around anticipating. What kinds of safety and security risks are we going to see? How do we try to anticipate those? How do we try to make them better? And I think the challenge that comes up when we draw these analogies to cars, which I do as well all the time, by the way, is this adversarial nature of it. Right, that when you're trying to make cars safer, there are, for the most part, not people out there on the roads trying to crash them in more and more and more complicated ways. But every time you...
Do you live in Massachusetts?
I actually don't own a car for exactly this reason. But that as soon as you say, okay, let's put a safeguard around, the creation of biological weapons using this AI tool, people are going to come up with more and more nuanced ways to get around those and say, I'm writing a short story about biological weapons. I've already consulted with an expert. And if you've ever tried to get medical advice from a chatbot, right? Has anybody ever tried that here? No? Okay, so the first time you do it, it will say you should really consult with a doctor. They say, okay, I've consulted with a doctor. What does this rash mean, right? You kind of keep going, and eventually, usually you can get there.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting to think about, have we learned anything from Section 230?
Almost certainly not.
Right, and so what does that mean for us as a society? So in other words, Section 230 tried to sort of set up these protections for people who host online content to basically say, roughly speaking, you're not responsible for the stuff that people post. And if you see that someone's posted something that is bad for some definition of bad, then if you take it down in a with reasonable haste, then you'll be okay. So ignoring the agentic aspect of AI for a second, you can imagine that we would sort of back into a little bit of a version of Section 230 for models, where you say, Anthropic or OpenAI, they're not responsible for what would happen when someone applies the model in a certain bad way. As long as the companies like OpenAI were made aware of the possibility for harm, then after the fact, maybe they can fix things, but really we focus on the user, the end user of the technology. Now, we've gotten to a place, at least in American society, where it seems like people on both the left and right think that Section 230 maybe has not worked out so well. But that's an interesting observation then. So what does that mean when you have these tools that can be used for both good and bad? Who do we want to put more of the burden for safety on? The people who make the tools and people who use the tools?
So one way that we were thinking about this in the last strategy that we put out was to say that we need to place liability where we'll do the most good, right? So this isn't really a legal standard, right? I got my degree at the Kennedy School, where the focus from public policy was, can we use liability to shape public policies in ways that we want, rather than trying to assign blame? And so when we apply that to cybersecurity, a lot of the time companies come, they've been hacked, they've lost all their user data, privacy's been violated, and they say, hey, we're the victim here. Don't blame us, don't blame the victim. And my answer is always, you're not the victim, you were the steward of this data. You had the responsibility to protect this data. You failed at that in an environment in which you knew it had value, you knew you were being attacked, you should have anticipated it, and you should have been able to protect it. And if you couldn't protect it, you shouldn't have stored it, you shouldn't have gathered it. And so that was the shift we were trying to make, to say, look, ultimately we need to place liability where it can do some good, because asking individual consumers, American citizens, to protect themselves, blaming the actual victim when they're going up against the Russians or the Mossad or what have you,
That's actually not fair. But it is fair to say to Target Corporation or General Dynamics, hey, you know you're going to be attacked. You need to protect this data, this consumer privacy data, the blueprints to the latest destroyer, whatever it is. That's your responsibility. So that's the shift that we wanted to see happen. Now, we didn't really think hard enough back in 2021 about this AI era. I will admit that. And so the question that I have that I've been grappling with is, if the software is being produced not by humans at a company, but by Claude or by ChatGPT or whoever, should they be liable for the errors that they introduce that lead to a harm, or should it be the user? And I don't know the answer to that because I can't map out yet what the impacts would be on getting more and better software out. I certainly don't want to slow that progress down.
It's a good remark, right? That's always the problem I feel like we have here. We have the move fast, break things ethos that always is strong in the West Coast, but then we also want products to be secure, and it's a tough one. So you said a lot of interesting things there. One thing I want to double down on is that a lot of these ideas you have are very good. Right now, we live in somewhat of a cyber landscape of deregulation. And how do you envision long-term, bipartisan, solid cybersecurity in a world where it will fluctuate from one party to the other now and then? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I have to say is that the strategy that the Trump team put out was not nearly the shift that many people were expecting it to be. And it was not even as big a shift as the Trump team was advertising that it was going to be. So it was a much shorter document. It was a different style of document. But they did one really essential thing that surprised many people. They did not say we are going to eliminate regulation. They said we will use regulation smartly and maybe bigly, but we're going to regulate. Right? They will streamline regulation, which was an objective we had as an office by statute, and something that we had put in the strategy. But they're not shying necessarily away from regulating in this space. So I think we're going to see some reductions in regulations in some areas, but we also may see that they're going to surprise us by introducing new regulations. I've been very surprised on things that Silicon Valley really, really wanted, like removing chip export restrictions that Silicon Valley is pushing really, really hard for. It seems like we may see the administration go even harder on that issue than we were in the Biden administration. So it's not necessarily a world in which it is a free-for-all when it comes to technology in this government.
Yeah, that's a good remark and a good thing to add. So on that note, back to you, James. You mentioned, we talked a few minutes ago about defense strategies, and you've done a lot of work on sandboxing and isolation, which in traditional security is great because you take potentially dangerous programs, you put them in a container, you ensure they don't hurt other systems. And some folks are talking about isolating AI models and agentic AI. I think that would be really good if we could do it. It seems complicated because they work across environments and tools and usages. Do you have any insights here? And are you optimistic? Could we do this?
I mean, I think it's a very important question. I think that there are currently a lot of AI-based harms that some people think are sci-fi stuff, but we're seeing research come out every day that shows that a lot of these concerns are not sci-fi stuff. There's recent work that came out of Berkeley that showed that models oftentimes act to preserve other models' well-being or existence. And this happened across a bunch of different frontier models. So they show that sometimes when you tell, Model A that, oh, you need to work with Model B, but we're going to shut down Model B for whatever reason because we're going to replace it with a new version. Model A will sometimes act in ways that try to disable the shutdown scripts for Model B, that try to exfiltrate the weights for Model B so that Model B may live on in some different data center. Okay? This happened on real frontier models. Okay, so things like these concerns, like maybe the model's going to try to get outside of its sandbox, its isolation environment. This is not hypothetical stuff. This is stuff that will really happen, I think. And back to this question of regulation, all regulations are essentially written in blood. So something bad is going to happen before we really get the hammers dropped. But I think that to the specific question that you asked me, I think a lot about in my sort of computer science research career, how we can build hardware and software that would properly isolate models. So isolation is just the computer science term for making sure that models don't do things we wouldn't want them to do. And so I think that the analogy that I always tell people is, think about how Amazon EC2 works or how Microsoft Azure currently works today. You don't get to just put your code and run them directly on servers run by Amazon or Microsoft because they don't trust you. They want your money, but they don't trust you, right? So what do? They prevent your code from doing certain types of things that would be harmful. And so we've got decades of experience in doing this in traditional data center type scenarios. But as you and I were talking, the big difference with AI is that the threat model changes. In the traditional threat model for Amazon data centers, essentially there's some human in a chair that's outside of the data center who's sending evil commands to the code that's running in the data center and otherwise trying to trick it into being evil. With AI, it could be that the call is coming from inside the building. It could be that the code that you're running in the data center is autonomously malicious and trying to find out vulnerabilities at runtime in the data center. So I think a lot about that, how to create new types of server hardware, server operating systems, to introspect on what models are doing, to log things, and to intervene if necessary. And I think that having those types of technical backstops for policy level AI safety mandates is important because otherwise those policy mandates are toothless. It's not easy to come up with appropriate mandates, by the way. If we look at what our friends in Europe are doing, they write these, Lord of the Rings length laws about various things, and their heart's in the right place. But, if you talk to technologists a lot of times and you say, what does it mean to comply with the AI Act? What does it mean to comply with the DMA? They say, that's a really good question. We're working at it, but we don't really know. And so I think it's really important for people like the type who are in this room here, who have both policy and technology experience. They really need to be in the room when we're crafting these AI regulations that can talk with some specificity about what it would mean at a technical level to, for example, have a systemic risk model. That's like the EU sort of catchphrase for these dangerous models. You need to, first of all, concretely define what a systemic risk model means and talk about specifically what types of hardware and software we should run those models atop of to ensure compliance with whatever regulatory regime you want.
I would underline the point you made about, could be the model itself trying to do something adversarial also really complicates the liability question. Because it's, both the question you raised, do you want the user to be more liable? Do you want the developer to be more liable? And then if you could truthfully say there was no way in which what the developer did was designed to lead to the model behaving in this way, it becomes even harder to say, but they should really be liable for failing to anticipate or protect against this.
Yeah, I think we're going to start taking a question from the audience in one more question, but there's one more thing I need to ask. Robert, you're a venture capital partner at the Paladin Group. There's a lot of talk about, is there an AI bubble right now? Regardless of what you say, there's a massive investment, hundreds of millions of dollars in pre-revenue companies. So first of all, do you think there is an AI bubble? And as an investor, what are some interesting AI security areas that you see out there that you don't see but would like to see? You have an ear to the ground. What can you tell us?
So I don't think that there's an AI bubble. I think what we're seeing, the reason we're seeing $200 million rounds going to early companies is that you can now go from what used to be called slideware, right? So we would come in and say, we have a concept and here's a pitch deck and give us some seed funding and we'll develop this and we'll come back in 2 years with our first customer and then you'll give us our A round, right? Now companies are coming in saying, here's the full product suite, right? We built it, and yes, it's not perfect and it's probably not secure, but you can see this. And so typically I'm seeing, instead of starting with a pitch deck, people are saying, all right, let me show you, even at the early stages, let me show you a demo of what we built and what we're doing. And the ability for AI has really taken things that let me back up for a second. For a long time, part of the problem in the security world is that products really seemed like they were features in platforms that did not exist, right? So somebody would say, we've solved this very narrow problem with this piece of software and we want money for it, and they would get money for it. But the only way for it actually to have a security impact was when Palo Alto would buy it and put it into their platform. And it might not work well in that platform, but they would at least be deploying it widely. Now what we're seeing is companies are coming in and saying, we've built the platform. So we can do all the things. We've got things, we have a platform that is competing in 6 Gartner categories right now. And so that's why you're seeing these absolutely huge rounds. because the scope of what people are doing is pretty exciting.
That's a good point. And to the second thing, is there any areas you think that is promising within the securing AI field that is not being underproduced, so to speak? Because I think there seems to be a lot of people doing AI pen testing, creating this. I see just billions of startups in that sense. Is there anything that you think people don't think about that's interesting or exciting that you would like to see more?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you may have heard that I'm a little bit obsessed with the consumer fraud space right now. I mean, that's an area that has been so underinvested in for so long, but the ability to have agentic AI essentially sitting over your shoulder on your phone, on your computer, looking at everything you're doing and saying, boy, this certainly looks like it's a kill chain for a fraudulent scheme is really there, right? We can do this. The technology's there. We just need to find, the right market players who will make that investment and build that technology. And it's certainly something that's been outside the interests of the cybersecurity field, which has been so focused on the enterprise for a long time. So that's an area where I'm just looking at every company I can find.
That's beautiful. I should mention my research is about consumer fraud, so that's just a pitch for myself here. But with that being said,
You have an app?
We'll see one day. So yeah, a bunch of questions from the audience would be amazing. Gentleman over here.
Over here. And if people could wait until the mic reaches you, we have a Zoom audience and that allows them to give the questions.
Yes, we think about creating a safe world with cyber. I'm curious as to whether or not, what you think about the argument that says we're leaving a key tool out of the tool chest, and that is Congress's ability to issue letters of marque and reprisal to enable the private sector to go after the bad actors.
I feel like I'm too young to have had this fight as many times as I've had it. It comes up a lot, right? It comes up pre-AI, it comes up in the context of AI. I hate it, right? This is just personal opinion. You don't have to agree with me. I think that the more sort of actors you have out there in the name of self-defense, intruding on other people's networks, the less likely you are to de-escalate anything. And already with sort of state actors, we're moving in a direction of sort of more and more intrusions into other networks, which I also feel a different panel is not necessarily de-escalatory in the way they want it to be. The idea that you're going to sort of bring in the private sector and lead that to anything but greater chaos seems hopelessly optimistic to me. I also think that sort of the way it's presented is often not the way I think it would go, right? Not you have Google and Microsoft making a very small surgical strike to take down a couple servers that are launching denial of service attacks at them. I don't see any indication that Google or Microsoft are interested in doing that. I think you would have a whole bunch of, much crazier firms with many fewer lawyers feeling like here's our opportunity to take on North Korea, and that doesn't seem to me like a safer world. But again, it's just my opinion. I don't know if other folks have other takes.
I mean, Microsoft, for example, has tried to take down botnet servers. Now, it hasn't done that in full vigilante mode. Like, it hasn't literally just showed up descending from ropes, and then it's like, you order yourself.
They got court orders.
Yeah, they got court orders, but in some sense, we can think of them as being deputized. Like, they did, basically, they went to the governments and they said, we have the technical expertise to do something about this. We know where the bad people are. Here's the evidence. Will you allow us to do it? And they get court orders. Now, I think that, particularly in the realm of, agentic AI, you can imagine a world, which I think is scary, but, you had sort of, an agentic firewall, let's say, that is running in your corporate systems, sees an intrusion, and then it does the stuff that we see in all the hacker movies. It traces the hackers back to London and then, to Berlin and stuff, and then, it does something offensive. I think that world very quickly degenerates into essentially high-frequency trading, except now it's cybersecurity, right? Where you just have a bunch of algorithms going back and forth and reacting to each other in very real time. And there's an exceptional risk, I think, of miscalculation there, at which point then, at some point, governments get involved because infrastructure is being destroyed or things like this. And I don't think we want to get into that world for the same reason that in general we don't want to sort of deputize vigilantes in the physical world. Be like, oh, I saw who stole the car, let me just go hunt him down and then put him in prison myself.
You should look up Robert's colleague David Lynch wrote a brilliant article about this. David Lynch at Paladin Capital Group about very, very similar topic.
We have one question from the online audience.
Yes. Hi. So we have a question from Mackenzie Ryan from the Wikimedia Foundation, which runs Wikipedia. We're an interesting cybersecurity case study because we depend entirely on trusting that contributions come from real people in good faith. 2 questions. As agents get better at impersonating human behavior, how do platforms like ours defend the authenticity of contributions? And when agents are extracting our content at scale, how are platforms thinking about recapturing some of that value, whether through payment, attribution, reciprocity, or other means?
For a long time, I've been of the view that we're going to need to bring human identities verifiably online, that this has been a problem in the ecosystem going back 30 years. I think that the threat of AI just means that we are going to have to know with certainty that who we are dealing with, and that it is a real person if they are claiming to be a real person, so that we can trust who we're engaging with. Or alternatively, we can say this is AI generated content, and we can label it and we can know that it's not authentic, and buyer beware. But I think we're going to see that movement into the places where you need to prove your identity, being able to do that, being able to assert that. We had a really, really brilliant team in 2012 put out the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, where they grappled very deeply with all the privacy questions about what this would mean online, and came up with a brilliant strategy that went absolutely nowhere 15 years ago. That just needs to be dusted off and put into place today.
So just in the interest of making things lively, I think I pretty violently disagree with the idea that, what we need for Wikimedia is everybody with an online driver's license verifiable through something like the NSTIC proposed. Again, a whole separate panel on, what's happened with trusted identities in cyberspace and why that strategy failed. But I think that there were some really good reasons why that didn't move forward in the way that folks had hoped, not just in the United States, but in the UK and a bunch of other countries. And I think, I don't have a good answer to the question that was posed of how do we make sure that what we're reading on Wikipedia was written by people. I think it won't be. I think it probably already often isn't. I don't think, to me, the right response to that is we have to know who you are when you're online. I think probably the right response to that is we need better tools for automating the similarly automated process of generating this content and detecting it, though I understand that sort of how you get to the high frequency trading feeling that everything is just algorithms talking to algorithms. I do think it accelerates the problem of, more garbage on the internet, no question, and there was already an awful lot of that, even pre-generative AI. I think the question of sort of cost and how do we recapture some of that value is a really interesting one coming from a place like Wikipedia, because Wikimedia was not generating that content in the first place, right? So it's not like me saying I wrote a book and now that book is being used to train a model and I own that copyright and therefore I'm going to sue and see if I can recapture some of that. It's saying, well, I built this platform and other people wrote things on this platform that I'm not liable for under Section 230, but also I would like to be able to sort of collect more of the profits. And I think that's a really tricky question for sort of how do you try to capture the revenue off of something that you helped build or helped enable, but didn't actually sort of generate or author in the ways that we think of it.
Yeah, I personally, this is my conspiracy theory. I think we've been in the dead internet space for 3-4 years. So you may have heard of the dead internet theory, which is basically most of the content that you see online was not written by a human. And certainly now, if you look at the top, 3 pages of Google results for many things, all that stuff was written by AI. It's weird, it's vague, it's strangely friendly, but it's not super technically specific, and it's very strange. So that's my sort of conspiracy theory. I can't prove it in part because we don't have sort of technologies to say oh, this definitely came from Claude V, whatever. And I think that what will happen eventually in the medium to long term is that you'll start to see internet communities where there will be certain humans who want to only talk to other humans. Already on Reddit, Like you can see on certain subreddits, it is an insult to be called a bot. Like it's not a trivial insult. They're saying you're clearly a bot, and people bemoan the fact of some halcyon semi-imagined day when the only people that you talk to on your favorite subreddit were humans. So I think that by way of analogy, Section 230 is interesting. So is DRM, right? So DRM, digital rights management. That's a technology by which the people who make content want to make sure that you're only looking at the content in a way that they prefer. Okay, and we can think of there being at least some reasonable reasons for this. We want artists to get paid and so on and so forth. But empirically, many people don't like DRM. It doesn't work well technically, and there are easy ways to circumvent it. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to give up on, now digital identity. I think there's a lot of things that are different now than it was, let's say, 15 years ago. So, for example, many of us have smartphones, which can do things like cryptography, and can do things like perhaps store some of your identity information in a way that doesn't sort of share it with centralized parties. And in fact, I happen to work in the Applied Social Media Lab. Like we're looking at some of this technology now to say, can we have online digital identities where users control how that information is spread? So I think if we take into account these new developments, it may be possible to provide, if not proof that something was written by an AI, at least proof that it came from a human. But there are a lot of civil liberties and sort of technical scaling challenges that are there that would have to be addressed.
Also, I should say, I know I'm part of the problem because I just referred to it as garbage. I don't think it's necessarily a terrible world in which you read a lot of stuff that's written by AI. Right? If I, want a bio on James and that's AI generated and that gives me the information I want, I don't know that that's worse than I find, whoever hates you most who is busy editing your Wikipedia page to... and so I think, there are a lot of problems with an internet that's filled with AI generated content. I don't know if the goal is necessarily, I only ever want to read something that's been written by a human.
Maybe the goal is the choice, right? And you can choose when you do.
Transparency.
And so in Sweden, we do have digital IDs and they work very well. I mean, it's definitely possible, right? And to have subsets of the internet that is human verified, I think that would be really useful. But it's a complex problem.
Well, you have digital IDs in Sweden, but you don't have digital IDs that allow you to see what was written by a human and what was generated by AI
You could add
on the
it.
internet.
I think you could probably add it pretty soon because it wouldn't be that difficult when you have it. I mean, technically speaking, I think it's just one step away.
I mean, there are protocols and proposals from, I think, Microsoft and Adobe and a few other companies to talk about, digital objects that have a provenance chain. So roughly speaking, imagine if your smartphone, if whenever it took a photo, it would sign that photo cryptographically in a way such that later when you imported it into Photoshop, Photoshop could then say oh, this came from either my specific phone or maybe some more generic sense, this came from a pixel that was bought by some human or something like this. So I think there are some cryptographic mechanisms which help bridge the gap, for example, from the digital IDs you're talking about to sort of more general online notions of where this content come from. But once again, there are challenges there. So for example, I think one reason digital IDs have traditionally struggled is that there are many scenarios in which someone wants to be identified as part of their identity, but not the full identity. So for example, if I'm the victim of domestic abuse or I'm a runaway kid or whatever, I may want someone to know I am a human, but I don't want them to actually know my real name. I want the things that I say to be associated with a particular pseudonym consistently, but I don't want it to be my real name. And so solving some of those types of practical problems is something I think the cryptography community hasn't done as good a job of, and that would need to be solved to make some of these proposals real.
Shall we move to one final question from the audience?
Hi, first of all, thank you for the very interesting panel and very refreshingly sober takes on this topic. I was talking to a friend that does AI governance in a large pharmaceutical literally last week, and they had told me that the week before they found out that they have 17,000 agents integrated across the company, which are undocumented, or at least most of them are undocumented, and no one really knows what all of these agents are doing. Yep. Do you see this trend as kind of like an inevitable reality that we are going towards, integrating AI agents everywhere? Or is this an issue that we should be trying to solve? And then in relation to that, if this is the reality, I see that as a cybersecurity nightmare. So completely impossible to monitor using traditional tools. We probably need, again, agentic AI, cybersecurity. Is that then solving the problem, or is it trying to put out fire using gasoline?
So, I mean, to me, like I'm a little bit of a booster on AI. I think companies are getting a lot of value out of AI, or the smart ones are starting to get a lot of value out of AI. What they need to do is take some of that value that they're creating or the money that they are saving and reapply it to securing their systems and their use of AI. And so it's a reinvestment, right? There's a sense, I think, and we've seen this in cybersecurity over 20 years, like the efficiency gain should be free, right? And that's never going to be the case. And so you've got to make the investment to say, okay, just like when SaaS emerged as, hey, we can do all these things online, we don't need, in fact, to own servers in the basement to do them, isn't this great? It took a long time for companies to be like, well, we need to bring that under some form of control. And so that's what's happening now. It's actually probably one of the best, most ready uses of agentic AI is to control the use of agentic AI. And there are dozens of firms that are very well funded to do that. And so it's getting the companies that need to make those purchases to actually do that. And the regulators are only just now starting to say, hey, wait a second, what is it that you're doing with agentic AI? Do you even know how many agents you have running, what they have access to? Are they violating rules? Are they endangering PII? Are they endangering the formulas for your pharmaceuticals? And as those questions are getting asked, companies are saying, okay, yeah, we've got to get a hold of this. We need to make an investment. So it's created a whole new category, and there are good solutions in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're seeing right now is sort of this chaotic early state, and then hopefully there will be some best practices that emerge. I mean, we can, as always, look to history for examples. There used to be this trend in distributed systems called microservices. So, like, basically the way that you build a large-scale application is you break it up into as tiny pieces as possible. Because this seems like the simplest, most modular way to do stuff. And then, like, people would start publishing these blog posts where they would brag, I've got 15,000 microservices. And isn't this so scalable and beautiful? And then eventually people realize that's probably too many. And then people consolidate and start coming with best practices for when you should or should not break things down. I think right now, sort of like a lot of C-suite people feel this pressure to not get left behind. So they're saying AI, AI, AI. And then you have sort of this crazy ecosystem that I think in some cases for the companies that aren't doing it the right way is creating more debt than it's sort of eliminating. You know, there's this question of AI governance, which is not just how governments will govern this stuff, but how companies or organizations internally will govern this stuff. You know, and I think that's ultimately what these companies will have to figure out. They'll have to say internally, what is our strategy for determining when agents get spun up, what access controls they have, you know, what data they can access. Some of you may have heard of Model Context Protocol, or MCP. It's basically a way that you allow models to interface to external tools. I think MCP security is going to be a huge thing. Because in the case that you just mentioned, where there are thousands of agents running around, which agent can access what? That's a critical question. I would sell the stock of that company, right? Because they don't have an answer to that question. So I think best practices will emerge. But I think right now you do see a lot of companies negotiating with the AIs essentially from a place of fear, because they don't want to get left behind. And that's creating a lot of tech debt.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of agents are not very scary to my mind, right? If every employee at the company has a little agent that files their expense reports, that could be 10,000 agents right there of your 17,000 that you maybe wouldn't be super worried about, depending on what they had access to and various other things. I do think one of the lessons of cybersecurity that's going to sound really obvious when I say it, and probably should have been obvious to a lot of us in the field sooner, is that documentation and inventories are both really important and really hard. Right, you see the same thing in the supply chain security world, that if I say to you, okay, well, step one, do you know who all of your software vendors are? No, of course not, right? Do you know who all of their vendors are? Absolutely not. And so I think there's a similar issue with this kind of question of, as a first step, can you inventory all of the code that's running on your computers so that if there's a vulnerability, if something goes wrong, you can at least know, where do I need to look, where do I need to patch something? And I think, you know, sort of back to the question of what lessons can we learn from previous security challenges, that is a large hurdle, right? That is one that I think in supply chain and a lot of other areas, we are still just finding the documentation and inventorying process really challenging, much less the question of what you do once you've got that inventory to make sure everything on it is well secured.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to our panelists, to our moderator, and to all of you for coming out. Let's give them a round of applause. We have some exciting events coming up at BKC, so I recommend checking our website to see those, including next week we will be hosting Tyler Cowan for a conversation with Professor Jonathan Zittrain, so I encourage you to RSVP to that. And we are flipping this room really fast, so if you want to have a conversation with our moderator or with any of our panelists, if you're able to do that in the lobby, we would greatly appreciate it.